You can redirect water on paper, but sooner or later, gravity reads the deed. The first crack appeared 3 days after Christmas, thin as a pencil line running beneath the stone veneer of the HOA clubhouse. By February, it was wide enough to catch the edge of a quarter. I knew exactly why it was happening. I also knew nobody at Cedar Ridge Estates would admit what they had done 6 months earlier, when they sent an excavator onto the drainage easement behind my property and rerouted nearly 40 years of natural runoff without asking me. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 46, a residential foundation contractor, and I own 7 wooded acres outside Fort Collins, Colorado, where winter doesn't arrive politely. It freezes the ground hard, thaws it under afternoon sun, then locks everything solid again after dark. Water matters here. Where it flows matters even more. My father taught me that before I was old enough to drive. He used to walk our property after thunderstorms in battered work boots, watching muddy ribbons of runoff slip through shallow swales toward the creek. Never fight water, Danny, he'd say. Give it somewhere safe to go. I remembered those words the morning I heard diesel engines behind my barn. The air smelled like pine, cold dirt, and fresh-cut earth. A yellow excavator was chewing through the drainage swale along my eastern boundary, its bucket scraping frozen gravel with a metallic shriek that carried across the valley. I walked downhill and found 3 workers laying black corrugated pipe into a trench. Standing above them was HOA President Caroline Whitmore, wrapped in a cream-colored winter coat, one hand around a coffee cup, the other pointing toward my property like she owned the horizon. Caroline was 53, polished, blonde, and permanently composed, the kind of woman who could hand you a violation notice with the same smile she used at a charity luncheon. Her white Lexus sat beside my fence with Cedar Ridge HOA papers spread across the hood. "Morning, Daniel," she said. "We're correcting a drainage problem." I looked at the trench, then at the survey stake they had pulled from the ground and tossed beside a pile of dirt. "That drainage problem is on my land." Her smile barely moved. "The board approved the improvement." Improvement? I could smell wet clay beneath the frost now, rich and mineral-heavy, exposed where the excavator had sliced open the slope. I followed the new pipe with my eyes. They weren't simply moving runoff away from the subdivision. They were concentrating it, redirecting water from 23 uphill homes into a narrow channel along my boundary, then cutting off the old swale that had carried it safely toward the creek for decades. I asked Caroline who designed it. She lifted her coffee. "Our landscaping contractor knows what he's doing." That answer told me everything. No drainage engineer, no soil study, no hydrology report, just an HOA board, an excavator, and confidence. I could have started shouting. Instead, I photographed the trench, the discarded survey marker, the pipe, and Caroline standing beside all of it. Then I noticed something she hadn't. The new grading didn't only change where the water entered my property. It changed where the water stopped reaching theirs. I looked uphill toward Cedar Ridge, where rows of expensive homes sat on clay-heavy soil already beginning to freeze beneath the December grass. Caroline thought she had pushed her drainage problem onto me. What she had actually done was interfere with the moisture pattern around her own neighborhood's foundations right before the coldest part of winter. I slipped my phone back into my jacket. "You're sure the board approved this exact design?" I asked. She gave me that smooth little smile. "Unanimously." I nodded once. "Good. Keep that paperwork." She laughed as if I had surrendered. I turned toward my barn while the excavator started grinding again behind me. Caroline didn't know what I did for a living. More importantly, she didn't understand what Colorado clay can do when its moisture changes and the freeze-thaw cycle takes over. I did, and winter had only just begun. By sunset, the excavator was gone, but the scar it left behind looked like somebody had drawn a dark line through the snow with a knife. I stood beside the barn with my gloves tucked into my coat pocket, listening to water trickle through the new pipe. That sound bothered me more than the machinery had. Water should have been spreading across the old swale, slowing through grass and gravel before reaching the creek. Instead, it came out concentrated in one steady stream, carving a narrow groove into the soil near my eastern fence. I measured the outlet, photographed the grade, then drove 2 orange survey stakes into the ground and marked the waterline with a carpenter's pencil. 26 years working around foundations had taught me something simple. Memory is useful, but measurements win arguments. The next morning, Caroline sent me an email. She called the work a community drainage enhancement and informed me that Cedar Ridge Estates would not be responsible for conditions occurring outside HOA property. I read that sentence twice over coffee. Outside HOA property. Interesting choice of words considering their contractor had been standing on mine. I printed the email and put it into a folder beside my photographs. Then I pulled the original property documents from the fireproof cabinet in my office. My father had kept everything. Surveys, easements, county drainage maps, even handwritten notes from a soil engineer who inspected the acreage when Dad rebuilt the barn in 1994. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard as I spread it across my workbench. There it was, the original drainage easement, recorded with the county decades before Cedar Ridge existed. The swale was not accidental landscaping. It was part of the approved stormwater path for the entire hillside. More important, the map showed something Caroline clearly had never bothered to learn. The soil beneath Cedar Ridge contained expansive clay. That kind of soil behaves almost like a slow mechanical system. Give it moisture and it swells. Take moisture away and it shrinks. Change those conditions unevenly around a foundation, especially through a Colorado winter, and concrete begins carrying stresses it was never designed to carry. I did not need to sabotage anything. I did not need to touch their property. Caroline's board had already changed the system themselves. All I needed was evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, I started a log. Temperature at sunrise. Temperature after sunset. Snowfall. Thaw conditions. Water depth at the pipe outlet. Photographs from the same 4 positions every morning. Christmas came with 8 inches of snow. 3 days later, afternoon temperatures climbed above 40 degrees, and meltwater poured through Caroline's new pipe before freezing again overnight. I watched clear ice form along my fence while the original drainage channel uphill remained strangely dry. That was when my neighbor, Tom Avery, stopped his pickup beside my mailbox. Tom had lived in Cedar Ridge since the first houses went up. He rolled down his window and frowned toward the hillside. "You know they changed drainage behind my place too?" he asked. I did not know. He told me Caroline had promised residents the project would eliminate wet lawns and reduce basement humidity. Several homeowners had approved it because she claimed an engineer had reviewed everything. "Which engineer?" I asked. Tom stared at me for a second. "I figured you knew." I felt the cold air tighten against my face. That evening I searched the county permit database. No engineering plan. No drainage modification permit. No geotechnical review. Nothing. Just a landscaping invoice approved by the HOA board. Then, on December 28th, Tom called me again. His voice sounded different this time. Quieter. "Daniel," he said, "there is a crack above my basement window that was not there last week." I drove over before dark. The snow squeaked beneath my boots as we walked around the side of his house. Under the yellow beam of my flashlight, a thin diagonal line ran through the mortar near the corner of his foundation. I crouched without touching it. Tom asked me what it meant. I looked uphill toward Caroline's house, then back toward the frozen drainage channel. "It means," I said, "we start documenting everything." Tom wanted to call the HOA immediately. I told him to wait until morning. Not because I wanted anyone's house damaged, and not because I was enjoying what was happening. I wanted facts before Caroline had time to manufacture another explanation. At 7:15 the next morning, I returned with a digital level, a moisture meter, a tape measure, and a notebook. The temperature was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost coated Tom's siding like powdered glass, and every breath hung white between us. I measured the crack at just under 1/16 of an inch near the basement window. Small, easy to dismiss. I photographed it beside a ruler, recorded the date and temperature, then checked the soil along the foundation. The north side still held normal moisture beneath the frozen surface. The east side was noticeably drier. That was the side closest to the drainage work. Tom watched me write everything down. "Can they fix it?" he asked. "Probably," I said. "But first we need to know exactly what changed." By New Year's Day, 2 more homeowners had contacted me. Linda Parker found a basement door rubbing against its frame. George Bennett noticed a hairline crack along his garage slab. Neither problem proved anything by itself. Houses move. Wood expands. Concrete develops cracks. That is exactly why I refused to make accusations. I created a separate file for every property and told each homeowner the same thing. Photograph everything, record dates, and do not repair anything until a qualified professional has inspected it. Caroline heard about my little documentation project within 48 hours. She arrived at my gate just after noon in her white Lexus, tires crunching overpacked snow. I could smell her perfume before she finished closing the door. "Daniel, I understand you have been alarming residents with claims about structural damage." Her voice had that polished board meeting calm, but her fingers were gripping a blue folder hard enough to bend its corners. "I have made no claims," I said. "I have taken measurements." She handed me a letter from the HOA attorney demanding that I stop interfering with association operations. I read it slowly while cold wind rattled the bare cottonwoods behind us. The letter accused me of spreading misinformation and attempting to undermine property values. I almost smiled at that last part. "Did your attorney see the drainage plans?" I asked. "The project was approved." That was not my question. Her jaw tightened. "Our contractor followed instructions." "Whose instructions?" Silence. Just the distant hum of a snowblower somewhere uphill. I handed the letter back. "You should ask whoever designed the system for the calculations." She stared at me. "What calculations?" There it was. The first real crack, and it was not in concrete. Caroline had no idea what should have existed before anyone moved that soil. I explained nothing. I simply closed my gate and went back to work. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived from the county engineering department. I had requested the historical drainage records, and the packet was thicker than I expected. Inside were old contour maps, easement documents, soil classifications, and the original stormwater design from when Cedar Ridge was developed. I spread the pages across my kitchen table while coffee steamed beside my elbow. Then I found a notation in the original engineer's report that made me stop. The natural swale along my boundary had been deliberately preserved to maintain balanced seasonal moisture across the lower lots. Alteration required professional review because of expansive soils and freeze-thaw conditions. I read that sentence 3 times. Caroline had not merely skipped a permit. Her project had removed a feature specifically preserved to protect the neighborhood she claimed to be improving. Outside, the temperature dropped below zero that night. The house creaked softly as the cold settled in. At 6:30 the next morning, my phone rang. It was George. "Daniel," he said, "you need to come see this." His garage door would no longer close squarely. I grabbed my coat, my notebook, and the county report. Caroline wanted me quiet. Instead, winter was starting to build the evidence for me. George was standing in his driveway when I arrived, wearing a flannel jacket over pajama pants, staring at his garage like it had betrayed him overnight. The morning air was brutally dry, 6 degrees below zero, and the snow beneath my boots made that sharp styrofoam squeak you only hear when Colorado gets seriously cold. His garage door was down, but the lower right corner hovered almost half an inch above the concrete, while the opposite side pressed tight against the slab. I set my tool bag down and ran the digital level across the opening. The numbers confirmed what my eyes already knew. Something had shifted. "It was fine before Christmas," George said. "I have lived here 11 years. Never had this happen." I crouched near the foundation wall and found another hairline crack extending from the corner toward the sill plate. I photographed it, measured it, then checked the surrounding soil. Dry again. Too dry compared with the protected side of the house. I could smell cold concrete and furnace exhaust drifting from the neighboring rooftops while George stood behind me rubbing his hands together. "Is my house sinking?" he asked. "I cannot tell you that yet," I said. "You need an independent structural engineer." That mattered. I built and repaired foundations for a living, but I was also involved in the dispute. Caroline would attack anything carrying my name. So I gave George the number of Rebecca Sloan, a licensed structural engineer in Loveland who had inspected several projects for my company over the years. Then I called Tom and told him to hire his own inspector too. Separate homeowners, separate reports, separate evidence. By the end of that week, Cedar Ridge stopped feeling like the polished neighborhood Caroline liked to advertise. Garage doors dragged. Interior trim separated at corners. One homeowner found a basement window that suddenly refused to latch. Another noticed a thin stair-step crack in exterior mortar. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. That was what made it unsettling. The changes were quiet. Millimeter by millimeter. Freeze, thaw, dry, contract. Then freeze again. Caroline responded exactly the way I expected. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting and blamed abnormal winter conditions. Tom invited me. Caroline objected the moment I entered the clubhouse. He is not a Cedar Ridge member. He owns the drainage easement you altered, Tom said. The room went silent. About 30 homeowners sat in folding chairs under fluorescent lights while the heating system hummed overhead. Caroline stood behind a folding table with 2 board members and the same blue folder tucked beneath her hand. There was no alteration, she said. I opened the county report. Then what would you call an excavator removing a recorded drainage swale? Her face tightened. She claimed the work had merely improved water management. I asked for the engineering drawings. She said the contractor had them. I asked for the engineer's name. She changed the subject. I asked for the permit number. That was when people started looking at one another. A man near the back raised his hand. Caroline, you told us an engineer approved this. She gave him a thin smile. Professionals were consulted. Which professionals? Tom asked. The heating system clicked off. Suddenly the room was so quiet I could hear somebody tapping a shoe against the tile. I placed a copy of the original development report on the table and pointed to the section requiring professional review before the drainage pattern could be changed. Caroline did not touch it. This proves nothing, she said. I nodded. You are right. That surprised her. So let independent engineers determine what happened. 3 days later, Rebecca inspected George's property. The following afternoon, another engineer examined Tom's. I stayed away from both inspections. I wanted clean reports with no influence from me. Friday morning, George called. His voice was almost a whisper. The report came in. I drove to his house and found him at the kitchen table with 6 pages spread beside a cold mug of coffee. The engineer had not blamed one single cause, but the conclusion was clear enough to change everything. Recent changes in surface drainage were a significant factor requiring immediate investigation, monitoring, and corrective action. I looked through George's window toward the frozen hillside. Then my phone buzzed. It was Tom. His report had reached the same conclusion. 2 engineers. 2 properties. Same warning. Caroline had spent weeks insisting I was spreading fear. Now I finally had something stronger than my opinion. I had professionals telling Cedar Ridge to investigate the one thing she refused to discuss. The 2 engineering reports changed the mood in Cedar Ridge almost overnight. Caroline could dismiss me as an angry landowner. She could not dismiss 2 licensed engineers who had inspected different houses and independently flagged the same drainage change. By Monday morning, homeowners were forwarding photographs, repair estimates, and old inspection reports to one another. Tom created a shared folder and gave me access. I watched the evidence accumulate like snow against a fence. Foundation photographs from previous years, closing inspection records, basement renovation pictures, even family photographs that happened to show walls before the cracks appeared. Caroline responded with another email. This one was longer, colder, and clearly written with help from an attorney. She insisted that homeowners avoid speculation until the board completed an internal review. Internal review. I read those words in my workshop while the propane heater clicked behind me. Then I looked at the county map pinned above my workbench. Something still bothered me. The contractor had not chosen that new drainage route randomly. The pipe followed a strangely precise path before emptying near my boundary. I pulled out the photographs I had taken the first morning and enlarged one on my computer. Behind the excavator, partially covered by dirt, was a white wooden stake with faded orange paint. Survey control. I remembered seeing similar stakes farther uphill years earlier when Cedar Ridge expanded its walking trail. The next afternoon, I drove to the county records office. The building smelled like copier toner, wet coats, and burnt coffee. A clerk named Susan helped me retrieve archived subdivision plans. We spread oversized sheets across a counter beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. That was when I saw it. The original drainage swale occupied a narrow strip of HOA land running behind several homes. According to a preliminary site plan filed 18 months earlier, that same strip had been marked for a proposed expansion of the community clubhouse parking lot. I stared at the drawing. Was this approved? I asked. Susan checked the file. Application withdrawn. Why? She turned several pages. Stormwater concerns. There it was. The county had already questioned development over the drainage corridor. I requested copies of everything. The parking proposal. Review comments. Withdrawal letter. Every page. Back at home, I compared dates. The county raised drainage concerns in April. The HOA withdrew the parking application in May. In September, Caroline hired the landscaping contractor. In December, the swale disappeared. I did not need to guess anymore. I needed the board records. Tom requested the meeting minutes and financial statements as a homeowner. Caroline delayed. Then she claimed several records were unavailable because the HOA had recently changed management software. That excuse lasted exactly 4 days. One of the board members, Richard Hale, showed up at my house after dark. His pickup idled outside my gate, exhaust hanging white beneath the security light. Richard looked exhausted. He carried a brown envelope under his arm. "I should have stopped this," he said. Inside were printed emails between Caroline and the landscaping contractor. I read them at my kitchen table while Richard sat across from me, staring at his hands. One message made my stomach tighten. Caroline had asked whether the existing swale could be filled enough to create usable flat ground near the clubhouse. The contractor warned her that changing drainage could require engineering review. Her reply was 4 words. "Keep this project simple." Another email instructed him to describe the work as routine landscape maintenance on the invoice. I leaned back slowly. The refrigerator hummed behind us. "Did the board know?" I asked. Richard shook his head. "She told us the contractor had handled compliance." Then he slid one final page toward me. It was an internal budget worksheet showing money reserved for preliminary parking expansion work. Caroline had not redirected runoff because homeowners complained about wet lawns. She needed the drainage corridor out of the way. The cracks spreading through Cedar Ridge were not the result of some innocent misunderstanding. They were the consequence of a shortcut. I scanned every document, saved copies in 3 locations, and returned the originals to Richard. Then I checked the weather forecast. Another hard freeze was coming, followed by 2 days above 45 degrees. More thaw, more movement, more water traveling through the pipe exactly where Caroline had sent it. I could have confronted her that night. Instead, I called the county engineering department first thing the next morning. Caroline had wanted to keep the project simple. I was about to make sure every professional who should have reviewed it finally got the chance. The county engineer arrived at Cedar Ridge on a gray Tuesday morning carrying a tablet, a measuring rod, and the expression of a man who had already seen enough paperwork to know somebody had made his week complicated. His name was Mark Ellison. I met him at my eastern fence while meltwater hissed beneath a thin crust of ice. The temperature had climbed to 47 degrees Fahrenheit after 3 nights below zero, and Caroline's pipe was running harder than I had seen all winter. Mark watched the discharge for maybe 10 seconds before looking uphill. "Where did the water go before?" he asked. I pointed toward the shallow depression now buried beneath compacted fill. He walked the old route slowly, checking elevations and comparing them with the original county plans on his tablet. Caroline appeared 20 minutes later. White Lexus, cream coat, blue folder, same performance, except this time nobody seemed interested in letting her control the conversation. "This is private HOA maintenance," she told Mark. He did not argue. He simply asked for the permit. Caroline said none was required. Mark asked for the drainage calculations. She said the contractor maintained them. He asked for the engineer of record. Her answer became a long explanation about landscaping improvements and homeowner complaints. Mark listened without interrupting, then looked down at the water cutting through the soil beside my fence. "Who authorized concentrated discharge at this location?" Caroline finally stopped talking. I stayed quiet. That was becoming my favorite part. By noon, Mark had inspected the clubhouse corridor, photographed the filled swale, and spoken with Tom, George, and 3 other homeowners. Then he placed temporary markers along the original drainage path and told the HOA not to perform additional grading until the county completed its review. Caroline turned toward me as if I had personally invented county government. "You are enjoying this," she said. "No," I answered. "I am documenting it." Her face went still. 2 days later, the HOA attorney sent me another letter, but the tone had changed. No accusations. No threats about property values. This one requested copies of my photographs and asked whether I would participate in a joint site review. I forwarded it to my attorney, Michael Grant, a property lawyer I had hired after Richard gave me those emails. Michael had spent 20 years dealing with easements, construction disputes, and insurance claims. His advice was simple. Do not touch their drainage. Do not redirect anything yourself. Do not give them an excuse to make you part of the damage. That was exactly my plan. I repaired the erosion occurring on my side only where the county allowed it. using gravel and temporary controls that did not change the discharge direction. Every receipt went into the file. Every photograph received a date. Every conversation went into a written log. Meanwhile, winter kept doing what winter does. Freeze. Thaw. Freeze again. Rebecca returned to George's house and measured the crack she had documented earlier. It had widened slightly. Tom's basement corner showed measurable movement too. Again, nobody claimed catastrophe. The engineers were careful with their language, and so was I. But the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Then Michael found the detail that changed our strategy. The recorded drainage easement did not merely protect the historical flow path. It required the party benefiting from the subdivision drainage system to maintain it without materially increasing the burden on my property. Cedar Ridge had done both things backward. They had removed the protected path and concentrated additional runoff toward my acreage. Michael tapped the document with his index finger. This is your leverage. I could hear sleet ticking against his office window. So we sue? I asked. He shook his head. Not yet. First, we give them one opportunity to restore what they changed. We sent a formal demand requiring the HOA to preserve all project records, disclose every contractor communication, and submit a professionally engineered restoration plan. They had 10 business days to respond. On the 9th day, Caroline called an emergency board meeting. Richard texted me from inside before it started. 3 words appeared on my phone screen. Insurance company coming. I stared at them while water murmured through the black pipe outside my workshop. Caroline had spent months treating this like a neighborhood argument. Now the people who might have to pay for her shortcut were about to start asking questions she could not bury in a blue folder. The insurance adjuster did not care about Caroline's smile, her title, or the framed community awards hanging behind her chair. His name was Evan Brooks, and he arrived with a camera, a laser level, and 2 thick binders tucked beneath his arm. By the time the emergency meeting started, nearly every folding chair in the clubhouse was occupied. Wet boots squeaked against the tile. Coats smelled like melting snow. The furnace pushed dry heat through the room, while homeowners whispered about repair estimates that were beginning to climb into 5 figures. Caroline sat at the front beside the HOA attorney, but the blue folder was gone. In its place sat 3 cardboard boxes of records. Evan began with one question. Who authorized the drainage modification? Caroline said the board had approved routine maintenance. Richard immediately raised his hand. We approved landscaping based on the representation that compliance had already been handled. Caroline turned toward him so quickly her coffee nearly tipped. Evan wrote something down. Then Michael stood and placed copies of the contractor emails on the table. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The dates did the work. April, county concerns about building over the drainage corridor. May, parking expansion withdrawn. September, contractor asked about filling the swale. December, excavator arrived. Caroline tried to separate the projects, insisting the parking proposal had nothing to do with the drainage work. Michael slid the preliminary site plan beside her email requesting usable flat ground near the clubhouse. The silence that followed felt heavier than concrete. Tom finally spoke from the second row. You told us this was about wet lawns. Caroline looked toward the attorney. He did not answer for her. Evan asked whether the HOA had notified its insurer before altering the drainage corridor. No. Had a licensed engineer stamped the design? No document could be produced. Had the county approved the work? Again, nothing. I sat near the back and listened. Months earlier, Caroline had stood beside my fence acting like authority was something you could create by holding a clipboard. Now every missing document had become its own answer. Then Evan asked to inspect my property. We walked outside into afternoon sunlight bright enough to hurt my eyes against the snow. The black pipe was still discharging. Meltwater ran over gravel, exactly where my first photographs showed it. I pulled the 2 orange survey stakes from beneath a protective cover. The carpenter's pencil marks were still visible. Evan compared them with the photographs from December. You have monitored this since installation? Every day. I handed him the log. Temperatures, snowfall, flow observations, photographs, dates. He flipped through several pages, then stopped at the picture showing the discarded boundary marker beside the excavator. They crossed onto your parcel? According to the survey, yes. Mark Ellison from the county arrived 20 minutes later with preliminary findings. The altered grading had obstructed the recorded drainage path, and the concentrated outlet did not match the approved subdivision plan. The county was preparing a corrective order requiring an engineered restoration. Caroline came outside just in time to hear that sentence. For the first time since this started, she looked smaller somehow. Not defeated, just suddenly aware that the situation no longer belonged to her. "Can we simply put the swale back?" she asked. Mark looked toward the frozen hillside. "Not with an excavator and guesswork. You need a licensed engineer, a restoration design, county approval, erosion controls, and monitoring." Michael added one more thing. "And Daniel's property damage claim remains separate." Caroline stared at me. "What damage?" I pointed downhill. Months of concentrated discharge had carved away soil along nearly 60 feet of my boundary and exposed part of an old fence footing. It was reparable. I had documented every inch. "The part you said was outside HOA property," I told her. Her own words landed harder than anything I could have invented. The following morning, Cedar Ridge residents received an email announcing that Caroline had been temporarily removed from authority over the drainage project while the insurer investigated. Richard called me before breakfast. "You should see what they found in the invoices." The landscaping bill listed routine maintenance, exactly as Caroline had requested. But attached to the payment authorization was another document. A concept estimate for the clubhouse parking expansion. Same contractor, same month, same section of land. I stood at my kitchen window watching snowmelt drip from the barn roof. The original survey stake sat on my workbench behind me, cleaned but still scratched from being tossed into the dirt. Caroline had moved water to make room for pavement. Now that little piece of ground was connecting every decision she had tried to keep separate. Richard emailed the invoice packet before sunrise, and one number caught my attention immediately. $28,400. That was the contractor estimate for preparing the drainage corridor as the first stage of the abandoned parking expansion. The description was careful enough to sound harmless: grading, soil stabilization, landscape improvement, and site preparation. But the parcel reference matched the exact strip where the old swale had been filled. I printed everything and drove to Michael's office through light snow. By 8:30, his conference table was covered with documents. The original subdivision plan, Caroline's emails, the contractor invoice, the parking estimate, the county review, my photographs, George's report, Tom's report. Michael arranged them by date without saying much. Paper had a particular sound when he worked, a dry sliding whisper that somehow felt more serious than shouting. Finally, he tapped the invoice. This connects motive to action. That afternoon, Cedar Ridge's insurance company requested a recorded meeting with the board. Caroline attended with her own attorney. I was not inside, but Richard called afterward. His voice sounded exhausted. The insurer had asked Caroline whether she knew the county had previously raised stormwater concerns about the parking proposal. She initially said she could not remember. Then they showed her an email she had personally sent acknowledging those concerns. That answer changed the room. Within 24 hours, the HOA board voted to remove Caroline as president pending a full financial and governance review. Richard became interim president. His first action was authorizing an independent civil engineering firm to design the restoration. His second was opening the HOA records to homeowners. That was when the project became bigger than drainage. Residents discovered Caroline had approved several expenses without the documentation required under the association's own rules. Some were legitimate services handled badly. Others needed explanation. Nobody accused her of crimes. Nobody needed to. The board turned the records over to its accountant and attorney and let professionals decide what they meant. Meanwhile, the county issued its corrective order. The old drainage function had to be restored under an engineered plan. The concentrated outlet near my property had to be removed, and disturbed areas required stabilization. Work could not begin until weather conditions allowed proper grading. So we waited. February became March. Snowbanks shrank. Brown grass emerged along the hillside. Every warm afternoon sent another pulse of meltwater through that black pipe. I kept recording it. George and Tom kept monitoring their houses. The engineers installed reference points and confirmed that movement had slowed as seasonal conditions changed, but repairs would still be necessary. Then came the settlement meeting. The HOA insurer agreed to fund covered portions of the restoration and eligible property claims, while responsibility among the association and contractors was sorted separately. My erosion repair was included. George and Tom received pathways for their documented structural repairs. Most importantly, Cedar Ridge agreed in writing that no future drainage modification affecting my property could occur without the required engineering review and legal authorization. Caroline sat across the table from me during the final session. No cream coat, no blue folder, just a gray sweater and a legal pad. "You could have warned us what would happen," she said quietly. I looked at her for a moment. "I did." She frowned. "You never said the houses would move. I asked for your engineer. I asked for your permit. I told you to keep the paperwork. You told me the board knew better." She looked down. That was all I needed to say. In early April, excavators returned to the hillside. This time they arrived with stamped plans, county inspectors, erosion barriers, and a licensed engineer watching every elevation. I stood behind my fence as they removed the black pipe. The plastic scraped against gravel with the same hollow sound I remembered from December. Then they reopened the broad, shallow path my father had taught me to respect. Spring runoff spread through it instead of concentrating at my boundary. Slow, wide, controlled. I pulled one of my orange survey stakes from the ground and looked at the faded carpenter's pencil mark from that first morning. The water was finally going where it had always been designed to go. But Cedar Ridge still had one meeting left, and this time Caroline would not be sitting at the front of the room. The final Cedar Ridge meeting happened on a warm Thursday evening in late April, when the last dirty patches of snow had disappeared from the shaded corners of my pasture and the cottonwoods were starting to show green. I walked into the clubhouse carrying one thing, the orange survey stake I had planted beside the pipe on that first morning. The room smelled like coffee, carpet cleaner, and damp spring jackets. Every chair was filled. Richard sat at the front as interim president, with the association attorney on one side and the independent accountant on the other. Caroline sat in the third row. Nobody had reserved a place for her at the board table. Richard began with the drainage restoration. The county had inspected the completed work and approved the restored flow path. Monitoring would continue through the next winter. George's garage had been stabilized and adjusted. Tom's foundation repairs were scheduled for May. Other homeowners with documented damage had entered the insurance process. My eastern boundary had been regraded, the eroded soil replaced, and my fence footing restored. Then the accountant spoke. The review found that Caroline had repeatedly bypassed required board procedures when authorizing the drainage work and had represented the project differently to residents, contractors, and board members. The parking expansion had never received county approval. The drainage alteration had never received engineering approval. The board voted to make her removal permanent and adopted new rules requiring independent engineering review for future work involving drainage, grading, retaining walls, roads, or common infrastructure. The vote was not dramatic. No shouting, no applause, just hands rising around a quiet room. That somehow made it feel more final. Caroline stood after the vote and looked toward me. For months, I had known her by the sound of her Lexus on gravel, the smell of expensive perfume in cold air, and that practiced smile she used whenever she believed paperwork belonged to whoever spoke with the most confidence. Now she looked tired. "Was all of this worth it?" she asked. I glanced around the room. Tom was sitting beside George. Richard had the original county drainage map spread across the table. Homeowners who barely spoke to one another in December were now comparing repair schedules and volunteering for a new infrastructure committee. "Protecting my property?" I said. "Yes." She lowered her eyes and left without another word. Outside, spring runoff moved through the restored swale with a soft, steady hiss. I walked home instead of driving. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. When I reached my eastern fence, I stopped where the black pipe had once emptied onto my land. Grass seed was beginning to take hold across the repaired soil. I pushed the old orange survey stake into the ground one final time, right beside the faded pencil mark from December. My father would have understood why I kept it. It was never really about getting even. I never damaged a foundation. I never touched a Cedar Ridge house. I never redirected their water back at them. I simply refused to rescue the HOA from a problem they had created while they were still denying it existed. I documented. I measured. I preserved the records. I called the professionals. And I let the winter reveal what their shortcut had changed. By the following December, the restored drainage system had made it through its first major freeze without new movement reported in the monitored homes. George sent me a photograph of his garage door closing perfectly against fresh snow. Tom joked that he had finally stopped carrying a ruler into his basement every morning. Cedar Ridge abandoned the parking expansion completely and turned that strip beside the clubhouse into protected open space. Sometimes I still walk the property after a storm, the same way Dad did. I listen to water moving through grass and gravel toward the creek, spreading instead of cutting, following the contours that were there long before Caroline ever held a blue folder. People like her think justice arrives with shouting, threats, or some spectacular act of revenge. Mine arrived differently. It came in photographs, measurements, county records, engineer reports, and one discarded survey stake. Quiet things, patient things. Because justice is not loud. It is smart, patient, and eventually inevitable. When an experienced foundation contractor discovers that an overconfident HOA president has rerouted decades of natural runoff along his Colorado property, a simple neighborhood drainage project becomes a costly lesson in engineering, property rights, and patience. These HOA stories follow the homeowner as he documents every pipe, survey marker, temperature change, and shifting foundation, while the HOA president insists her unauthorized project is nothing more than routine landscaping. As winter brings repeated freezing and thawing, homeowners begin noticing cracks, uneven garage doors, and other signs that force independent engineers, county officials, attorneys, and insurance investigators to examine what really happened. Unlike many HOA stories built around instant revenge, this dispute becomes a careful battle of records, measurements, permits, easements, and professional evidence. The homeowner never damages anyone's property or redirects the problem back toward the neighborhood. Instead, he protects his land, preserves the evidence, and allows qualified professionals to uncover how the HOA president bypassed engineering review while attempting to clear a protected drainage corridor for a proposed parking expansion. What begins as another example of HOA stories soon exposes missing permits, misleading explanations, contractor emails, insurance questions, and a paper trail the HOA president can no longer control. As the original drainage system is finally restored and affected homeowners receive a path toward repairs, the community learns why infrastructure cannot be changed simply because someone with authority believes rules are optional. For viewers who enjoy HOA stories about private property, legal strategy, construction knowledge, neighborhood disputes, and satisfying accountability, this story delivers justice without reckless retaliation. In the end, the foundation contractor proves why the most memorable HOA stories are not about who shouts the loudest. They are about patience, evidence, expertise, and letting the truth become impossible to ignore.